in the spirit of a new rabbi, I thought I'd tell my favorite rabbi jokes. Rabbis love jokes, and it's a joke about a rabbi, so what could be wrong with that? It's an old joke about the new rabbi, and it's his first Shabbat at his new synagogue. And he gives his sermon, and he's so happy and proud of himself. And at Kiddush, everyone's saying, Rabbi, what a beautiful sermon that was. Rabbi, that was the best, that was the best, that was the best. And then one man from the shul comes up to him and says, Rabbi, I have to tell you, it was the worst sermon I've ever heard in my life. I've never heard a sermon that bad before. It's total garbage. I don't even think you're reading the same book the rest of us are reading. I don't know what planet you were on. Boy, that was a bad sermon. The rabbi, of course, was crushed, right? All of the good feedback didn't matter. It was that one person stayed with him. And you could see it in his face. So the shul president came over to him, right? The shul president's always there. He got the rabbi's back, right, David? Saw his face and said, Rabbi, what's wrong? This is your first Shabbat. Why aren't you happy? Why aren't you excited? Everything's going great. And he said, someone told me it was just the worst sermon they've ever heard. And the president asked him, who was it? Who said that? So he pointed to a guy in the back of the room eating, his bagel, his tuna salad, his lox, whatever it was, herring. And the president says to the rabbi, oh, Shlomo? Don't listen to Shlomo. He's never had an original thought in his life. He just keeps repeating what everyone else says to him. So the moral of that story is, afterwards at Kiddush, if you have complaints, you can bring them to Raquel. And if you have anything nice to say, please, I'm happy to hear it. No. But our parsha this week, Korach, is really a great parsha. It's one of my favorites. And there's a lot in it to talk about. There are a lot of interesting things that happen. There are a lot of different areas that the commentators, the rabbinic authorities, and everyone throughout the centuries have taken this parsha and lessons we can learn from it. But the lesson I want to focus on, the reason I like this story, is that Korach's the underdog. Now, I know he's the bad guy in our tradition, but he's going up against Moses and God. And when you go up against someone that has God on their side, right, by any definition, you're the underdog. And who doesn't love an underdog's story? I think part of it is he's a button pusher. He's asking people to think differently. He's saying something different than what everybody else is saying. And I've been known to be called a bit of a button pusher at times myself. I know my mom's watching, and hi, Mom. And she's one of those people who's told me that I know how to push a button. So I want to look at Korach's sin, the buttons he's pushing, and ask, really, what was his sin? What did he do that was so bad? We know he led a rebellion against Moshe and Aaron. He gathered the people together. And what is it he says? Rav lachem ki ha'edah kulam kedoshim. You have gone too far. The entire community are holy. Why have you elevated yourselves above everyone else? God is in everybody's midst. All are holy. What's so bad about that? Everybody is holy. That's what our tradition teaches, right? We're mamlechet kohanim, a nation of priests, a holy nation. What was wrong with what Korach said? The rabbis, they don't like him. They trash him throughout the commentaries. He and his descendants and his children become the example of the worst of heresy. Right? There's midrashot, teachings that they're still rotting away in Gehinnom, and you can hear their voices crying up through cracks in the earth sometimes from their punishment after the earth swallowed them. Because the rabbis say he's not sincere. He doesn't really mean what he says. He's not really trying to elevate everyone else. He's trying to put Moses and Aaron down so he can raise himself up. But it's his intentions the rabbis disagree with. What he says, they don't take offense to. All the people are holy. Kol ha'edah kedoshim. The entire nation. So there's a beautiful midrash, or an interesting midrash might be a better word. It's a rabbinic story filling in the blanks, asking how did Korach gather up so many followers when everyone had witnessed what the miracles Moshe did, the miracles God performed through Moshe, how could he gain so many supporters? So they fill in the blanks with this story. It's a midrash on Tehillim, the book of Psalms. And they say that Korah gathered people together and said, you know what? In my old neighborhood, there was this widow. And this widow had adopted 2 young orphan girls, right? Really like laying it on thick here, right? Preparing us to feel for them. And she had a modest field that she planted some crops in. And you know what happened? Moses came over and said, you can't plant different seeds next to each other, and made her tear up the plot. Later, when she was harvesting things, Moses came and said, you have to leave the edges of your field empty, or there, you can't collect it, so that the poor can come collect it. It's a commandment in the Torah. But she needed that food, every bit of it, to survive. And it goes on and on and on. Moses comes back and says, give tithes to the priests. She can't afford to give tithes. She's suffering. Finally, she gives up. She realizes she's not going to be able to keep anything that she plants, so she buys a couple of sheep. She figures she can sell the milk to make money. She can make some clothing for her kids from the fur, from the wool. But what happens? She goes to shear the sheep, and Aaron comes and says, the first gleanings, the first shearing, that goes to the temple. Give it here. It's a commandment. The sheep give birth. What happens? Aaron comes and says, the firstborn, go to the temple. Give it here. Finally, she shecks them. She slaughters them so they have food to eat. And what happens? Again, Aaron shows up and says, the meat goes to the temple. So this is Korach's story, the rabbis say, how he convinced everyone to turn on Moses and them. He gave this example of the law blindly applied, causing this woman suffering. And he said, Moses and Aaron raised themselves up, and they claim it's God, but it's not. Now, Korach wasn't sincere, the rabbis tell us. But his words, his critique, that's not what the tradition takes complaint with. We know that the law blindly applied can cause injustice. We know that the law blindly applied can cause suffering and pain, and we see it. We see it in some Jewish communities, and we see it in other faith communities, and we see it around the world. Where religious law, without thinking about the person it's impacting, does the exact opposite. Instead of raising people up, it knocks them down. And we know that that's not what Moses did, right? Moses went back to God just a couple of weeks ago when the Israelites came to him and said, we weren't able to participate in the Pesach sacrifice. Moses goes back to God because it's unjust and comes back with Pesach Sheni. When the daughters of Zelophehad go to Moses with another injustice, he goes to God and he comes back with a more just answer. The problem is today, there are religious leaders, there are institutions who look away in those situations, who are blind to the suffering that the application of the law sometimes creates. Even worse, sometimes they see the injustice, they see the suffering, and what do? They say it's not really injustice. It's God's law. How can it be unjust? It's what God wants. What God wants is an interesting concept. When I first came to Beth Torah, I fell in love with, this whole room's gorgeous, but the verse here above the ark, it's actually one of my favorite in all of Tanakh. We have a painting in our home that a Jewish artist did that's based on this verse. Higid lecha adam ma tov uma Adonai doresh mimecha. Listen, God has told you what is good and what God requires you, what God wants of you. Ki im asot mishpat, do justice, va'avat chesed, love kindness, ve'etzena lechet im Elohecha, and walk humbly with your God. That's what God wants. It's a verse from the book of Micah. More than 2,500 years ago, Micah understood and declared boldly what the essence of Judaism was. And he wasn't alone. There were other prophets that shared his vision, great rabbis from the Talmudic ages all the way until today. In each generation, there have been those who spoke with that prophetic voice. But in each generation, another voice has been getting louder and louder, drowning it out. A voice that demands stagnation. that wants tradition at the exclusion of all else, that wants adherence to the law, to the ritual, to the acts, to the exclusion of the rest of who we are. A Judaism of just halakha without the agadah, the stories, the people. But a Judaism without halakha is meaningless. But a Judaism without agadah, without the people who live it, is even worse. It's nothing. Korach accused Moses and Aaron of focusing on the law to the detriment of the people. But today we see sometimes it is others. It is institutions, it is religious leaders. We can see in the data, in the demographic studies, people are leaving Judaism in huge numbers. What's the largest growing denomination of our faith right now? The nuns. 1 in 4 Jews who are Jewish halakhically, who are Jewish by birth, and identify when asked what is their religion, their answer is none. Nothing. And there's been a rigid focus on Jewish law that hasn't taken these people into account that I think is responsible for this. And I'm happy to see it changing. I'm happy to see synagogues and institutions beginning to start doing the work, to start doing things differently so they can stay relevant for future generations. And it's why I'm so honored to be the rabbi of this community, because we're going to be at the forefront of that work. And the reason we're going to do that is because Beth Torah already has been there. And we're going to continue to do that and build on what has already here, the strong foundation. We're going to refocus on serving the members' needs, rather than wishing that they had the same needs that their parents and grandparents did. We're going to be on the front lines of welcoming and bringing back Jewish communal life to those who have been shunned and excluded, whether it's for their sexuality, their gender identity, the faith of their partner, or any other belief. We're going to be on the front lines of making Jewish rituals and wisdom accessible to all, regardless of prior knowledge. Kol ha'edah kulam kadoshim. Everyone in the community is holy. The entirety of the Jewish people. And the Torah is their heritage, it is their birthright. And we can and we will offer a Judaism that engages people intellectually, that draws not only on the depth of wisdom from our tradition, but on science and literature, poetry and philosophy. We'll have classes and pathways to help people learn ritual skills, to find meaning behind them. And we'll have classes in Jewish art or culture, Jewish food and more. Whatever it is people want to learn about. We want to be the center of their Jewish life. We want to support them. Anyone who wants to build a Jewish home, raise a Jewish family. We'll offer a Judaism that engages people's hearts and their souls, their spirits. I can't get over how beautiful the sanctuary is. But what really impressed me was a story I only learned just recently about where the synagogue got its name, Beth Torah. What I've been told is that there is a Torah here in this ark that some of the founding members had saved during the Shoah. And that Torah was preserved, and it's been here, first I think in a portable and eventually here, and used at all of the synagogue's major celebrations and major moments. That's what this synagogue was founded on. It was about preserving Torah. We're going to do the next step in that. Because a Torah that's in an ark with nobody to hear its words, nobody to live by its wisdom, to feel its teachings, its meaning, what it can offer them, it's not much good to us. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to continue that legacy. We're going to honor those who built this shul, those who dedicated their lives to this synagogue, to this community. And I'm so thankful and honored by the opportunity to be a part of the next chapter of Beth Torah's story, to carry that on. While Korach's motivation was wrong because he sought to serve himself, today his question is the right question. It's a question we're going to ask ourselves. Isn't every Jew holy? Kol ha'edah kadoshim. And as a community, we're going to ensure that anybody who wants to be a part of that community, who wants to engage in Jewish life, is going to be a part of it. Because what does God want of us? It says it right there. We should be reminded every week. do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly before God. Shabbat Shalom.